in terms of my personal journey, it's framed by my evolving understanding of the Holocaust, my relationship to the Holocaust, and my generation's experience as opposed to my father's experience. My father was a survivor from Hungary, and I grew up in a very charged Holocaust environment in Brooklyn in the 1960s, which is to say that the Holocaust was still a raw and living experience.
Right.
It was not yet history.
Right.
And the way that I was raised was to look at the entire non-Jewish world as hostile. And my father used to say that the non-Jewish world is divided into two categories: those who actively want to destroy the Jewish people, and those who are tacitly pleased that others are doing the dirty work.
Yeah.
And that was a fairly representative attitude, an understandable attitude for the survivor generation. So I grew up in America in the 1960s, the most expansive time in history, in any culture, where the whole world was opening and everything was changing. And I was very interested in what was happening outside of Brooklyn. But I lived this kind of schizophrenic life where part of me belonged to the 1960s, and part of me belonged to my father's traumatized worldview. And eventually I came to realize that my generation's experience was so radically different from my father's that the distance between us should have been measured by centuries and not decades. That my father's generation was the unluckiest generation in Jewish history, and mine was the luckiest. And eventually I moved to Israel, and when I told my kids, who are dual citizens, I said, you have the two dream passports of Jewish history.
Right.
And with all the changes that have happened since October 7th, that's still true. And so my evolution was becoming part of the far right Jewish political world. Meir Kahane was my hero, was my leader when I was a teenager. And that was an attempt to come to terms with my father's identity,
Right.
that I thought I needed to inhabit. And eventually I came to realize that that way of living my Jewish identity through rage, suspicion, fear, was faithful to my father's experience, but a betrayal of my experience. This is really just shorthand for a very long and difficult spiritual journey that began in a very narrow place, the farthest extreme on the Jewish map, and gradually working my way toward the center of the Jewish map, of the Israeli map.
So after October 7th, did your map change again?
I can't say that my illusions were shattered. I don't think I really had too many illusions.
Yeah.
A lot's happened over the years. But October 7th really in some ways magnified the fear that Israelis rightly have toward a West Bank Palestinian state. The problem is that it's more complicated. It's always more complicated.
Yeah.
So for me, and I think for other Israelis, there were two takeaways from October 7th. The first is, you have to be kidding me to ask me to consider a Palestinian state on our most sensitive border.
Yeah.
The second takeaway is that Ariel Sharon was right. We can't live in one political entity between the river and the sea with these two peoples together. We can't live with Gaza as part of our society and part of our state. Sharon was vindicated by October 7th. And so what do you do with that? That on the one hand, you can't have a Palestinian state, on the other hand, you can't share a state together.
Right.
So that is, for me, that's the dilemma of October 7th has really just magnified what has been clear all along, that we must have a two-state solution, and we can't have a two-state solution. And I don't know, I don't know how to navigate that. I mean, if you push me to the wall and say, okay, what's your greater fear? Is it a Palestinian state or the absence of a Palestinian state? My greater fear is the absence of a Palestinian state, but just barely. The crime that the anti-Zionist progressives are committing against American Jews is that they are returning the conditionality of Jewish acceptance. And the way that that plays out on campuses especially is, we'll accept you. We're not anti-Semitic, but you have to give up this part of your Jewish identity. And in the past, America always accepted its Jews with a certain amount of conditionality.
Yes.
Don't talk with your hands, don't be too Jewish, don't be too overtly Jewish.
Right.
Maybe it's a good idea to change your family name to fit in. And of course, this is America, we'll accept you. But there was this conditionality. And anti-Zionists have restored conditionality to Jewish acceptance. And the fact that it's happening on campus is an even greater shock for American Jews, because it was on campus where American Jews first experienced complete and unconditional acceptance.
Yes.
And I experienced that I went to Northwestern in the...
One of the centers of the pro-Hamas movement.
Yes, but and I went there shortly after Northwestern gave up its Jewish quotas. I was my class was one of the first.
Really?
I went to Northwestern in the 70s. Oh, Northwestern was infamous for its Jewish quotas through the 60s.
Okay.
And my experience there was unconditional acceptance. I was a very Jewish Jew at Northwestern. And it was so liberating for me. That was, by the way, part of my own evolution in breaking away from Jewish extremism. I felt, maybe my father didn't quite have this right. Maybe it was true for his experience in Europe, in Hungary, but it's not necessarily true for my experience in America. I went back to Northwestern a few months ago to speak.
Yes.
And it was a profoundly depressing experience, because I met Jewish kids there whose experience of Northwestern is 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
Not my experience. They feel isolated, socially ostracized, and that's not true for all Jewish students, but it is true for those who are pro-Israel.
Yes.
And so they're congregating among themselves, and exactly the opposite experience of my generation, and vindicating my father's worldview.
So, Yossi, you mentioned that, let's talk about the other side of this equation. You mentioned the progressive left. You and I have both worked on outreach for years now with the American Muslim community. Isn't that the center of gravity for what's happening on campus?
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily the progressive left, it's American Muslims who have allied with.
Well, I think that they're setting the tone for the progressive left, and certainly on campus, the progressives are realigning with Muslim students.
Yeah.
And this is, for me personally, and I would guess for you too,
Yeah.
a deep shattering. Years of work.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to eulogize that work,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly requires some readjustment.
And what are those readjustments looking like for you?
You know, the program that I was involved with at the Hartman Institute, the Muslim Leadership Initiative.
Yeah. When I started, that was, and it remained, the premier outreach.
And what made MLI unique was that we placed Israel at the center of the program.
Exactly.
We're not going to do polite dialogue.
Right.
We're going to confront the hard issues up front. So it's not as if we try to prettify or avoid the hard work. We put it front and center.
Yeah.
But what really I think needs, for me, what needs to change is that we need to be clearer about what our mutual expectations are. And my expectation of any Muslim that I'm in relationship with is that you don't immediately resort to Israel as Nazi, Israel as genocide rhetoric. And that's not your default position when things go bad in the Middle East. And criticize Israel, demonstrate against Israel, but be very careful about what you say and how you say it. And don't join in the movement to turn Israel into the world's criminal state. I'm out of that relationship. So I think it's premature to really speculate on long-term transformations. But what I see happening now is really three simultaneous trends. The first is the mainstream pro-Israel Jewish community has been substantially strengthened. All kinds of people who were really outside of the orbit of organized Jewish life, whether it's Hillel, whether it's Jewish organizations, are being pulled in. Synagogues. It's happening, for example, I was speaking with a friend of mine, a rabbi in Vancouver recently, and he said that Israelis who live in Vancouver are joining synagogues for the first time.
Right.
And so
that means something serious has happened.
And what I think it says is that those who already had a positive Jewish identity but hadn't really activated it now feel the need to actually be affiliated. So the mainstream core, the pro-Israel core of the Jewish community has been strengthened. And Hillels have seen a tremendous increase in attendance. So that's the good news. The opposite extreme is a rise in organized forms of Jewish anti-Zionism. And that's happening certainly on campus. And there we see the opposite, which is people who are already wavering, who are already having deep feelings of alienation toward Israel, are now expressing it also in an organized way. Now, it's a much smaller group. There's no comparison. The problem is that the media treats them as an outsized importance,
Yes.
and by magnifying them, that also has its own self-fulfilling momentum. You increase their ranks. So what we've been experiencing, certainly before October 7th, mostly in the American Jewish community, is a return of pre-Holocaust organized forms of Jewish anti-Zionism. What will be the post-war emotional state of Israelis? Will we be a society that's going to revert to pre-October 7th schisms? And part of me is already there. Part of me, I'm so I'm so profoundly disgusted with this government and having this government. It's leading us through the most difficult period in Israel's history. We have the worst government at our most desperate time. And I don't know what to do with that. I feel as a liberal Zionist that I'm fighting on three fronts. I'm fighting on our borders against the Iranian axis. I'm fighting for Israel's legitimacy around the world. And I'm fighting to save Israeli democracy and Israeli decency. It's deeper than democracy. It's the decency of the society that this government has violated. So I feel torn between these three fronts, and they're entwined, because what happens on one front will affect the other. If this government is allowed to destroy Israeli democracy, God forbid, it will impact on Israel's legitimacy around the world. It will impact on our ability to fight this war effectively. So what happens on one front affects the other fronts. Sure. The pro-government camp needs to ask itself some very hard questions too, starting with, was it worth it? Was it really the most pressing issue on the Israeli agenda to strip the Supreme Court of its power? Was that really our biggest problem? And no acknowledgement of the fact that the Supreme Court actually is far more diverse than the right claims it is. The Supreme Court has gone through evolution since the days of Chief Justice Aaron Barak. No sense of regret for what you did to this society. And the Orthodox community needs to ask itself some very hard questions. This is Israel's first de facto Orthodox government. Not in name, not officially, but a majority of the coalition's Knesset members are Orthodox. The agenda, the political agenda of this government is Orthodox. You, the Orthodox community, believe that you should be leading the Jewish people. Well, you've led us over the last 2 years. Look where you've led us to. We've never been in a deeper abyss than we are now. And that's you. That's this government. That's the Orthodox community. So every part of Israeli society needs to ask itself some hard questions in order for a process of national healing to begin. And I think we do have leadership, political leadership for that process. And they're waiting in the wings. And we will need some form of unity government to replace this government, which is the most homogeneous in Israel's history. It is a coalition government, but it's a coalition of right and further right. And if you look at previous Israeli governments, and one doesn't even have to go to the Bennett government, which was maybe the most heterogeneous government in Israel's history.